Good morning, good evening, good day, greetings, and a little bit of salutations with a side of welcome to the Safe Room featuring Security Side Quests. I am one of your hosts, Tristan Watty, and I'm joined by, hold on, we have to take the pause and say the marvelous, the mysterious, the magnificent, the maven himself, Russ. How's it going?
It's going great. How are you doing? And how is everyone in the chat doing? Feel free. Let us know how you're doing. It's Monday. I had my coffee. I'm good to go. Let's do it.
Yeah. 3 or 4 coffee cups down, and we're through Monday almost, kind of. But as always, if this is your first time joining in, thank you. And second, let us reintroduce ourselves. So my name is Tristan Watty. I come to you from the professional services side of AWS, specifically in the security sector, where we help to accelerate customers' journeys, adoption, and everything in between in a secure manner, fashion, and way. And Russ, where are you coming from?
I come from the customer incident response team. So I help AWS customers contain, mitigate, and get back to baseline after a security incident. So
Russ is the person you want to see sometimes, right? For fun stuff, not the other stuff. But if you do have, feel free to reach out. Outside of that, as we always like to ask, where is everybody tuning in from, listening from, or just plain old watching from? And if you would like to kind of take it one step further beyond, you can answer this question. And it is a lengthy one indeed, because it takes some time, some pause, some prowess to go through and understand, would you rather have unlimited access to all the world's music, but you can only listen to each song once, or be limited to just 100 songs of your choice that you can listen to infinitely? Russ, where do you go with this?
I'm definitely going to go with 100 songs that I can listen to infinitely. I have a very obsessive type of personality, so I would definitely choose those 100 songs over and over again.
Yeah, it's funny enough that I'm right there with you. Like, there's some songs I listen to more than 100 times, probably a day, just because it's on repeat in the background. So yeah, I can carve it out, because my mind goes to math. It's like, all right, what are my gym songs? Yeah, there's about 10 to 15, you can get through. And then you go, oh, what song I'm going to eat to, dance to, all that kind of stuff. And you can also cheat and just have one long playlist, and that's considered one song.
That's true. But it would also kill me, because I'd have a song stuck in my head, and I'd be like, damn, I can't play that song. It's not on my 100. And that would also drive me nuts. So
yeah, little things like that. And as always, excited to watch from LA. Thank you, Ari. And if we were to continue going down this path and thought process, I think it kind of leads us somewhat into today's topic, but no spoilers. I'll let Russ kind of chime in from where we were and where we're going today.
Yeah, so if you joined us last week, you know that our last episode was related to AWS WAF solutions. Our episode was called One Rule to Block Them All. But this week, we have a new one. We're going to go over AVA, and that's going to be labeled the Fast Travel Disabled Until Identity Verified, which is relevant because we're going over AVA. So yeah, I think this is going to be an interesting episode. I don't have a ton of experience, like hands-on, especially with like incidents regarding AVA. So I'm excited to do a little bit of learning,
Yeah. And I think
talking too.
Yeah, a little spice on the side of it. And I think what the interesting thing is some customers, and what we've seen, don't know the full extent of how AWS Verified Access can help them. Because as we saw the migrations away from, on-prem environment, you think of, client VPNs, and this is what we have to access, and these are the routes they can take, things of that nature. They might not be familiar with the zero trust methodology and kind of the approach that you can do with that, right? So I think one of the ways that we can go through this is to take that step back, as we like to do, and start to chat about, hey, what is zero trust with AVA or AVA, or however you would like to say it, and then kind of dig into kind of the foundations of zero trust as a security model. Because when you're shifting away from the traditional perimeter-based security to the more granular approach, I think verified access kind of applies to it just a tad bit. And one of the ways that we like to explain and speak about it is identity systems. Kind of, how do you check your creds? Right? Simple statement, one sentence, but very complicated depending on how you tend to implement it, right? Because you can have a variety of different identity providers to authenticate users before granting application access. But how do you kind of weave all of these together, especially with OIDC and SAML standards and having something like AVA to validate, right? Mm-hmm. So we can touch upon that as well as some policy configurations. How do we unlock the new areas? So we get to the front door, but how do exactly we get into the side door and the other door behind that? Things of that nature. And that's where you start to talk about the policy language that goes into it. It's CEDAR, CIDR, depending on how you want to say it. You start to think about those different pieces. It's always interesting. And the side tangent is how you pronounce different items, right? In the technology word versus the English word. But side quest for another day. But implementations. I always like to divert a little bit. It's like, do you ever think about that? And start to go through, what? How do you implement? How do you kind of start your implementation strategy? We talk about the target state security strategy, but from a remote access standpoint, how do you kind of gear up your organization and have high valued applications protected? How do you map your existing identities to something like an AVA? These are all important parts of the puzzle that you have to consider, right? So we said a lot of words, and the way we like to put these words into action is with a little bit of a poll. And it's kind of to shake off the cobwebs or kind of energize the mind. So the first poll is select your difficulty level. And it kind of goes along with, the theme of today, all right? So you can't go forward until your identity is verified. But how do you do this? And then how do you get to the point where you consider what's challenging to my organization? What's challenging to my engineers? What's challenging to my governance strategies? And feel free to put in the chat 1, 2, 3, or 4 when it comes to, hey, access management, zero trust, identity integration, compliance requirements. What is your difficulty? Russ, where do you go with this?
So I think I would go with identity integration. I think that is an issue for that can be an issue for any team at any maturity level. It is especially tough, when you're trying to do things like, for example, integrate, say, cognito pools with, an external identity service, say like Okta or something like that. And so, just being able to do all of those integrations, but still organize and maintain your identity, and ensuring that, things are properly integrated. So as, one thing doesn't completely derail all of your AWS account, because I have seen some incidents that did deal with the integration of identity, just people being like, oh, I didn't realize that, this part of identity affected, my entirety of my AWS IAM, maybe your on-prem identity, or whatever you're using, can definitely have impacts and effects on your AWS account that I think that sometimes goes overlooked.
Yeah. And those are a couple of good points of, oftentimes when you're looking at your solution or the service that you're using, sometimes what we see customers do is they look at the service in kind of like isolation or just in a bucket without looking at the entire roadmap of how do you get to that service to start off with, right? So to your point, where you think of identity and the provider that you're using and how you're setting up groups, things of that nature, because if you don't have something like your user group set up in an appropriate way with the appropriate governance strategies, you start to get to a point where, hey, if I put a user in this group, they're all the way through and can access whatever the case may be. So at that point, it doesn't matter what controls I have at the tail end, because they've been granted access and kind of been kind of walked through the process a little bit of how they get there, right? And I think that also leads a lot of people to try and understand something like zero trust and how it can be applied within their environment. And the reason why I say that is what you see traditionally with, let's say, client VPNs and access is once you get put into a group, then you have access, you have VPN access, right? Mm-hmm. But if you don't have the correct segmentation in those groups, then once somebody has access to the network, they have access to the network, and then that's when you go to the next layer. Do you have the correct identity pieces, and so on and so forth? And Bevan suggests compliance requirements reinforcement. Yes, that's often the case as well, right? Of having compliance as one of those toll gates that you need to have within your organization of, hey, we're implemented security minimum baseline. We're going through the process. What compliance, what is our North Star that we're heading towards when it comes to our compliance? Are we PCI DSS? Are we SOC? What are the cases, right? Mm-hmm. And starting to develop appropriately. But I think the place to start with kind of AVA, I'll call it AVA for today, right? A little bit of a less, right? We shorthand the shorthand. So with AVA, you start to have the concept of never trust, always verify. This is something simple that can be expounded upon a lot. But essentially, think of zero trust. The way I like to look at it is if you have your house, right? Your house may have a fence. And within that fence, in the traditional approach, is, okay, if your fence is locked, then nobody can get in. If you give them a key, they can get past that fence, right? So, okay, next piece might be the door. Do they have a key to your door? All right, maybe they have those two items. But the change with zero trust comes into you need to authenticate and verify your identity at every step of the way. So even if you get into the house, in order to get to the kitchen, you have to be able to identify yourself. And be able to get to the fridge, you have to identify yourself, right? And that simple concept is how you have the least privilege, and you never trust, you always verify. Because what happens, and the way you remember this analogy, somebody eats your sandwich, right? Because eventually you get to the kitchen, the fridge, and somebody eats your sandwich, and then you're like, hey, what happened? Right?
It's the worst feeling.
Yeah, right? So you just have an empty wrapper in there. So things you try to stay away from, but things you're trying to move towards is understanding first how to say, hello, yokai, thank you for joining. The second piece is, why does it matter to have zero trust? Well, when you think of the overall cloud approach, the traditional security perimeters have kind of been dissolved in such a sense, because you start to think of cloud adoption, you think of remote work, you bring your own device, all these items that you have to consider. So network location is not the only sufficient, let's say, proxy for this anymore. Because before, you're like, hey, I'm in the building, I'm able to do this, I can control the user traffic, but they might be somewhere else on their own device trying to access sensitive pieces of information. So how do I do this in a compliant manner with granular controls and comprehensive logging? Because logging helps Russ, right? We always, that's going to be a catchphrase, a tag, and we're going to get a hat that says logging helps Russ. Right? Just rotating in the background. But these are some of the fundamentals that you start to get through and understand the core components of what's making up. So once you understand zero trust, now you can start to get into, right, how do I kind of go about setting this up, right? What does the architecture look like? Well, there's a couple of different pieces your application, and we could do a deep dive into a bunch of items, and we'll show you a couple of knowledge quests in a bit. But essentially, you want to think about the decoupled design method, right? Separates the authentication, authorization, and the application. Remember, you want to verify, right? Hey, it's in the name. You want to verify the identity of these users at every step along the way and evaluate them against a set of policies or processes using the CIDR, depending on how you say it, heard it both ways, when it comes to the real-time analysis of these different components. Right? So I think part of the piece of understanding is that exact piece. Right? I said piece a couple of times because there's one piece to remember. If you see what I did there, 10 billion points to you. But the traditional VPNs have to be kind of adapted to a method that fits your cloud strategy. So you want the granular per application access instead of network-wide access. So, Russ, I don't know if you've seen from your side, kind of what are some of the benefits as you start to think about this approach?
Yeah, so there's a lot of benefits. I think that just being able to have that level of granularity is extremely huge, especially for a lot of the types of organizations that I've dealt with. I'm sure you've dealt with 100 times more, but you have very structured industries like finance and stuff like that, and there's so many different controls that have to be compensated for, and having that level of granularity to be able to say this IP range is this organization, it has nothing to do with the actual customer's bank account information or whatever, just a whatever example, and so you're able to do that while still ensuring that the people over here that don't need the finance information still do need information from whatever, pick your service or database or whatever. So that sort of thing is extremely important to your overall security strategy. But when we mention, I'm going off a little bit on a tangent, but when we mention zero trust, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's supposed to be. There is no trust. So you're not using any earlier authentications or anything like that. Like every step of the way, it has to be re-verified, which is why I think there's not quite as many true zero trust maybe environments or applications or whatever, just because it can degrade performance in certain things. I'm not saying in general zero trust is bad because it degrades performance, but it is something that you definitely have to keep into consideration because of how many different checks there can be. And so, yeah, I think that there's a lot of benefits there. Also, it's, AVA in general, or AVA, however we're going to do it today, is supported by IAM and IAM Identity Center, as well as other like third-party SAML providers, so like Azure AD, Okta, stuff like that. And so, so it is extremely beneficial, and it really does, integrate relatively easy compared to some other types of identity. So, you know what, let's just go through a kind of a little bit of the walkthrough of the flow of how the authentication works. And please correct me if I'm wrong, Tristan, because, this is based off of less so my personal experience and more just based off of research. So the way that this works is the user initiates the connection to whatever the AVA protected resource is. AVA is going to redirect that to whatever IDP you have configured, your identity provider. So whether that's Microsoft Active AD or Cognito or IAM or whatever you're using, Okta. So that identity provider is then going to authenticate the user and then send that SAML assertion back to AVA. So instead of going directly to the authentication. AVA is going to be the one that redirects that to the identity provider, gets the SAML insertion from the identity provider, and then sends it back to AVA. And then AVA is going to evaluate the policy inside the AVA itself, and that's when it'll grant or deny access. So it really does add in that extra layer and provides that like you said, that checkpoint at each step.
Yeah, exactly. It's that secure authentication method. Exactly, you said, right? You go to whatever application URL, you go through the process, and the thing that you kind of see is the tokenization process that's happening, right? It tries to separate and extract the identity information, the group membership, all the other attributes that you're defining, and go through that overall process, right? And then managing that session, right? And we always say short-term credentials, not long-term, right? Especially when it even comes to sessions, you want to be especially vigilant there as well, right? So having these mechanisms, to your point, is a big thing. And it also goes back, and just taking a step back, to your architectural design. Because as you mentioned, Russ, if you have all these checks, what are you checking against? And I think part of what you were saying with latency occurs when you have checks that may not be necessary for your organization, or a path that starts to get to a point that, hey, it's not beneficial to the overall workflow. So I think that's one of the considerations you have to have as well.
Absolutely. And then going back to what you were saying earlier about session management, there's definitely some ways to do that as well. So we have different things like you can configure the session duration, which is important because, when we, especially from me, my perspective, the temporary tokens are sometimes used as a form of persistence. So using those session durations can really help keeping those low. So that way, even if someone who isn't supposed to have access does gain access, it's a shorter window where they have access and they have to re-authenticate. So that can make things much more difficult for, both the attacker and you if you don't use the session duration. But there's also other settings like idle timeout you can use to, prevent someone from having long-term access, even though they're not doing anything within the application or whatever resource you're trying to protect. But then also this has session persistence across applications. So even if you're using that session, an application, and, whether you're trying to do something additional in another application or trying to access a resource, whatever it may be, it varies wildly based off of what you're trying to do and your environment and stuff like that. But you can use that session persistence. So there's a lot of different things, that can be done. And then there's, of course, MFA. There is native MFA support. I always recommend using MFA wherever possible. Even if it is just a phone number and a text, it's still better than nothing. Ideally, you would have a very strong MFA with some sort of physical token. But if not, there's still a lot of ways that you can do that. You can also integrate the MFA support with IAM and IAM Identity Center, so that's always helpful. You can use SAML-based MFA with third-party identity providers. There's the time-based one-time password, the TOTP application integration support. And then there's, like I said, hardware tokens and even biometric options within your identity provider. So there's a lot of different ways that you can use MFA with this. And that's just adding another check, ensuring that the right people are having the right access at the right time. So there's a lot of different things to not only consider, but also to implement and kind of architect your way through.
Yeah.
And I think that's
I think that's a very important part, right? There's a couple different things that you can work your way through, and a couple of different, I would say, ways to go about implementing into your environment. And the audible, I would say, right here is this blog post, right? Of gaining secure access to on-premises applications using verified access. And this whole thing just seems like, wait, what can I do with because you often think of, okay, I'm going to gain access into my AWS cloud environment, but what if I need to do the reverse of gaining access to my on-prem environment, right? And this blog goes through kind of the setup of, hey, what is the exact architecture that we would need to do this? And some of the core pieces are still present. And why we often suggest to go through and document and, hey, what is your security strategies? Because when you try to implement these different services and work backwards for how you're going to leverage them, you start to open up the possibilities like what we were just saying, where you have your on-premise environment, you may have a user that's external. And because we're starting to think and leverage some of these IDPs, think of IAM Identity Center and using a verified access endpoint, now you can get to the point where you are going all the way to your on-prem environment in a secure manner, fashion, way, right? And I think that enables your overall organization to grow, right? Because now you're not limited to thinking of, oh, it's just a one-way street. This is a two-way street that you can make secure by having these multiple checks within your environment. So little components like that start to get you to think about, right, how do I do this? What are my posturing pieces, right? So if I have a device, do they have to have certain certificates, right? As Russ was saying, the MFA components, biometric factors, depends on your organization. So when you start to go through and understand these different components, it really helps. So the next piece of that is answering the question of, will there be a session about this at AWS reInvent? Also, do you give discount for AWS reInvent? I would say tune in to the AWS reInvent page to see what upcoming sessions there are. And no, I do not give session discounts to reInvent. I don't believe Russ does either. But feel free to look into the different pages for reInvent and dig in. So kind of something else. Russ, you go.
Oh, sorry. I was just wondering if the reInvent schedule had even been posted yet. I was like,
yeah, that's the thing is, I don't know if reInvent is to the first week of December. So as the upcoming weeks are coming through, you'll start to see more information. But don't forget cybersecurity in October of just digging into these different topics. So watch some great AWS Twitch and YouTube shows focus on that. Like,
get yourself ready.
Yeah. There's certain shows that might cover certain topics. I'm not going to point towards any specifically, but I can put up a banner that says it. So as we start to dig in, let get off our tangent and start to go through how we get to this place of understanding. Well, what we were trying to do is work backwards from our situation. And that's kind of why we went on the tangent of using AVA to get into the on-prem. But I think a good piece of this is to look at some past experiences, some legends, as some might call it.
I'm so sorry. Before we do that, can I just jump in real quick to say that our producer, Jeff, just posted that blog link that you were just in, Tristan, in the comments. So look for that. That will give you the link to that blog post.
Exactly. And then you could go on your own legend, and we'll get to a couple more side quests with that. And the way we like to think about the customer stories is through these different experience points, these different, side quests, for lack of better words. But part of it is starting to go through and understand, one, what do we do? Second, how do we have epic music play? And three, how do we dive into the situation, the task, and all those things in between? So let's set the scene of our, I would say, financial services company. We'll go with that. let's say it's a global securities something or other company that's based in the financial services realm, right? So, being financial services, they have to have secure access to maybe critical trading applications, developer environments, and everything in between to start to go through. But they have a traditional VPN infrastructure, and it's causing them significant challenges because remote traders face maybe frequent connection drops during market hours, which is something that is not beneficial to anybody at that point. And because they're dealing with this latency, the dropping connections, things of that nature, they're trying to figure out a different way to, one, increase their capabilities, but also reduce the amount of incidents because their SOC team might have, and most likely have, multiple incidents where they have inconsistent patterns across different regions happening. So they have their environment in such a way that they need some scalability. And it's kind of a little bit all over the place because you're trying to control global policies for mission critical applications in such a way that they need a particular way, fashion, and form into their environment securely. And with that being said, I take the pause and say, hello, Victor. Yes. So one of the things that we need to think about is what we just went through with that scenario. Is we have a financial services customer that has distributed users that are trying to remote access and VPN in, and they have connection issues. So the question I pose to the chat and then to Russ is, what type of access challenges do you have? What impacts your business needs? And it could be anything. It could be maybe global policy, something along those lines. But Russ, what do you often see as what impacts customers?
Yeah, I think I'm going to go with global policy management. But if I can, kind of sneak in a side one, like a 1B, that would be like the global policy management, and then configuring specific policies for things like developers and administrators and the people that keep everything running. So kind of I guess setting those policies for different the access controls for different I guess job categories, or based off of what they're looking to do.
Yes. And with that being said, I think if we kind of look into it, but take that step back, see what I did there. As we look at the challenge, I think part of it is understanding and bringing to light our side quest board, right?
Of course.
And for you first-time joiners, the side quest board is a visualization of our scenario, our customer environment, our AWS environment, and the thing that we are trying to solve today with AVA. But let's review. We have a customer being challenged in a financial services vertical that they have fragmented access management, maybe cross-region authentication because they're a global company. They have some legacy systems that are integrated. Now they're trying to access critical applications. So how do we do all this? How do we protect? How do we think about this? So when you start to get to the point of understanding this, you start to ask yourself multiple questions of, how do I have an authenticated user that is, I would say, trusted, but there's zero trust? So you have a user that's trying to access your AWS environment and everything in between. Well, now you start to think of, okay, what is the path that I can take that's not leading directly into somebody sitting in the middle of that access request and grabbing my creds or something along those lines? Well, I think it starts to go down the route of thinking about the services. So right now you could say, oh, let's put the AVA symbol down, but it's not that piece of the puzzle you want to go to first. What you really want to understand is, what type of identity factors do we have? And if I were to reroute this appropriately, right, it's close enough right there. So if we were to reroute this identity plays a big part, because how do you shape your policies, your posturing, things of that nature? And it's verifying the user's identity. So these two do not look the same, right? How do you check that piece? And making sure that you're leveraging something identity wise or something in between is happening, right? So when you start to go through, you start to think about, hey, what is the next step? And we have some questions. Does AWS AVA offer integrations with AWS Firewall? Trying to determine if we can do things like break and inspect. So that is a good question to go by. So when you think about this, what are you trying to accomplish with your AVA in a zero trust manner? Because are you trying to make sure that users are authenticated the way they're supposed to be, or are you trying to manage network traffic? Because what we were saying before, the networking is a separate part and way to think about it now, right? Because zero trust, there's no trust. Now you're starting to get to a point where, hey, you have all these authenticated users in a manner that they're getting checked at all these different points. So you're getting away from kind of like the client VPN side of the house, right? But thank you for that question. Mm-hmm. So let's see if we can solve that as we go through our scenario. But I think part of the question also goes to Russ. How do you handle the global access changes portion of this, right? Because it's a global company. How do you do this?
So I would go with a bit of a hybrid approach. I do think that there's plenty of capability within CI/CD pipelines, but also, which is our automation guild, according to my manual here. But I also think that our IAC champions, aka CloudFormation, Terraform type of thing, is also very useful. I think those two mixed together, using the hybrid approach, would be my answer. I think that there's a lot that can be done there.
Yes, definitely. The hybrid approach is always a nice mixed methodology, right? Because the thing that we're trying to move away from is essentially going to the console and doing items, because the scalability is not there. Mm-hmm. So you want to have something like a CI/CD pipeline deployment, automation, and some different IAC within there. So the solution that maybe we're trying to get to is having a standardized approach, a standardized automation mechanism. So how do we do that? Well, we have maybe a centralized AVA portal that can be accessed. We establish some regional access controls, because not all regions are created equally when it comes to how they access, compliance requirements, so on and so forth. And then one of the important parts after you do the policies, posturing, and all those kind of things is how are you auditing, how are you logging, how are you monitoring? Because this plays a part of that end-to-end cycle that we were talking about. So if you're just focusing on this one piece and not focusing about the overall monitoring approach, you start to get to a point where, hey, you have maybe somebody accessing that maybe they have elevated privileges or something along those lines. And did they need to access this application? Is there time restrictions? Because if we're talking about a financial company, maybe we only have the access for that remote capability from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Do they really need to be trying to trade at 10 p.m., right? Things like that. So you start to get into this rhythm of understanding.
Knowing engineers, yeah, they will need access at 10 p.m.
There's always the one ticket, right? I need access to do this one thing. So going along those lines, so now how do you start to build up and validate all these access challenges? How do you start to have the visualization build out? Well, I would say it's as simple as this. I can put AVA in here, but not to complicate the situation is you have identity, you have the posturing checks, and then you access the AWS environment. That's how simple it can be. There's pieces that go underneath. And I think that's the important part to think about is it's not just one service. It's your overall security defense in depth approach. To the earlier point made by HEP is, oh, I want to do firewalling with AVA. Well, they're separate services, but they don't integrate directly. But you can take a complementary approach on how you handle it. So all these things play into the part of the puzzle. So to essentially take that step back, you want to hit the pause game button, the Zach Morris timeout, as I call it, and think about that a little bit more in depth. Right. So as we stop, we start to think, hey, how do I appropriately handle, let's say, policies? Because we understand the end to end, but that in-depth part we took out for a reason. Because one, if you don't go through and understand the policy approach, especially for a CEDR, CIDR, however you want to say it, you start to, what do they say? Have a bad time, right? Because it's part of figuring out your access controls. It's part of figuring out how you stay away from what we call is the sad, right? Because if you don't understand the principle, the action, the resource, the context, all these pieces define the CEDR policies, right? So when we start to go through and handle these items, we start to, if we want to talk about how to handle more subs, like and subscribe. Shameless plug, but sorry, Victor, I couldn't resist that piece. But when you start to go through and understand the access controls, that park is an important part of the puzzle, right? So the principal, the entity requesting the access, the user of the system, the action that is going to take, or the operation that's being requested, the resource, which is the application, and the context. What is the environmental information? And that starts to break down the policy part of it. And all those policies are stored and grouped into a policy store, right? Multiple statements can be combined into one policy. So you have those fundamental pieces in there. And that's kind of the CEDR approach. But there's other pieces of the puzzle that you start to think about, right? Because we spoke about kind of separating, authentication and authorization. Now you can start to think about, okay, if I'm thinking off models, how does ABAC come into play, right? So the attribute-based access control. Because all of this is part of that holistic strategy that we're talking about. Because if you have a user attribute, for example, you have the identity information, which group they apply to, the department, their job title, their security clearances, if you have it, or custom attributes, because you can be authenticated from another IDP. So all these items play into it, as well as device and the request context, all these items. I say items 3 times because I want to get the point that you want to think about it at each step of the way, because least privilege is a real thing. And I say that a couple of times for the people on the other side of the internet as well. So there's a lot of advantages to something like AVA, right? Because it greatly reduces the policy management overhead with ABAC, and you can adapt, let's say, automatically to organizational changes. So you want to get to that place where you have the automation, where you have these different applications, application roles, things of that nature in place. So all these are part of your overall strategy. And I think the most important part, and I would say, is to test the policies. Because oftentimes what we see, and Russ can attest, because I saw that laugh, was a person who seen, hey, we implemented this policy. Did you test it? And that's where the ... comes from, right? Is you want to make sure that you have a policy testing and validation process of how do you go through and verify this level of access, right? Russ, what has your experience been with policy testing?
I mean, I've seen policies and rules everywhere, not just with AVA or AVA, IAM, with, rules based on, who's able to access, not an actual policy, but the like ACLs and security groups and stuff like that. So kind of everywhere you go, if you have some sort of rule, you should be testing it, because otherwise you'll come to me, I'll say, well, what is this rule specifically, this one that allows all traffic for all IP addresses to be able to, hit your port 22 or 23 or whatever. And so, it's not just, saying, hey, we need to implement these things. You need to make sure they work. And the way to do that is by testing, because you don't want to test with a threat actor, because that's the type of test you'd like to have prepared and not fail before you even get started. So yeah, I think that's definitely something I see on a regular basis, and something that should definitely be a part of your pipeline whenever you're integrating or re-architecting or doing whatever to be able to add a new service or whatever, or just one single new policy on or rule on it, your AVA, your WAF, your security group, whatever. Yeah, I think testing is extremely important.
Yeah,
and I could bring receipts for that one.
Russ has a scroll that is off camera right now. He's like, test. And going through that mindset and just thinking about it, right, is what are your testing best practices? You follow some of the guidelines, you have the outline procedure, you have your governance strategies, things of that nature. Do you have positive and negative test cases? Access granted, access denied, right? You can go on and through that methodology, that approach. But I think a part that comes up is, all right, if access is allowed or access is denied, how are you capturing that? And this is where we revisit the conversation of logs, right? And that's part of your overall implementation strategies. But I think a nice little poll to kind of think about is, if you had AVA, which logs matter the most? So feel free to put in the chat 1, 2, 3, or 4. But Russ, where does your mind go?
So my mind 100% goes to all available logs, but that feels like cheating. So I'm gonna go with I'd say user session data. I think authentication events is important. It's kind of like your VPC flow logs or your network flow logs, where it doesn't provide you with all of the information, but when we're considering cost and how expensive logs can be, that's definitely something you take into consideration. So if you are not able to provide all available logs because we're part of a business and we have budgets and stuff like that, so authentication events is a good, I think, first layer type of logging source, where that's where you're going to go to see, okay, who logged in or authenticated at this time, during the time of the event, or during this, maybe it's not actually an incident or an event, just looking to see for whether things are actually working correctly, or if you're actually going through and trying to investigate a security event. The first thing I'm looking at is times, so that way I can start refining my queries and getting as little but impactful information as possible. And then I think that the policy decisions and user session data are a little bit more deeper into that. So I think I'd go with all available logs if possible. But if there's some sort of a roadblock to that, especially when we're considering cost, then I think authentication events would probably be my that's what I would like to be able to have access to if I'm doing some sort of investigation or whatever. So, yep.
And it's interesting because this always goes down to which way you're looking at the overarching solution, right? Because my mind goes to policy decisions to start off with.
Someone
right?
agrees with you,
Right? So it's like providing the visibility into why access was granted or not granted, right? Of if I'm thinking about a security incident, how do I get to a point where I'm like, all right, what was happening at this point? If I see a policy keeps getting hit for whatever reason, or something keeps getting granted, then it's like, what? They're not supposed to be granted full access to this, right? And that's kind of where I start to go with it. So it's interesting, right, of going through and understanding the impact points. But from a TDR perspective, it's like, all right, if I had only one log to pick to rule them all, then I start to go through and it's like, all right, how can I simplify this stuff for myself, right? And kind of think about it. So if you were to go through and implement AVA, right, where do you kind of start, Russ? What is your thought process?
Yeah, so for implementing, first off, you got to go with your prerequisites. So you have to have your AWS account with appropriate permissions, obviously. You need to have a configured identity provider, which you most likely do, because otherwise, how are you authenticating? Ideally, you would have all of your applications and or resources that you are looking to protect with AVA. So having like an inventory sheet or some sort of whatever list of those resources. Ideally, you'd also, if not having a network topology like diagram, but just like some sort of general assessment of the network. And then the other thing that I think doesn't get talked about much, change management process. You need to be able to document, these changes that you're making as you implement them. So those are the things that we need before we start. But then once we actually get into, like the implementation phases, I would say that there's, for this example, I'm going to go with 4 phases. So planning and design, initial setup and testing, then a pilot deployment or testing deployment, and then full rollout. And so basically what you're going to do, planning and design is phase 1. So you're going to define your scope and what you're looking to do. You can map existing access patterns and authentication, and use that to be able to design your AVA architecture. Using your existing patterns, what is critical information that you want to have that AVA extra step, and then using that to build out the architecture. So that's going to move you to the next step, which is initial setup and testing. So you're going to want to configure your AVA architecture, ideally in an isolated and or testing environment. And that's where you're going to actually integrate with the identity provider and create your first or basic policies or draft policies, whatever. And then that's when you move into the actual deployment, not the full rollout, but your pilot or testing deployment. So ideally, this would be non-critical applications, with a small pool of users, and ensuring that you're not going to do a full rollout to all of your critical applications and then have everything just shut down because you, accidentally denied all. And so after you have that, you can gather feedback and metrics. You can roll out to, or go to your full rollout, which is going to expand to all of your applications. You're going to migrate all of your users, preferably in batches, and then get rid of the existing legacy, either access or the architecture or whatever you're using to switch over. And so that's kind of what you're looking at when you're going to implement all of these together. So it is a multi-stage approach, but when you're dealing with this sort of thing, you don't want downtime and outages. And then looking at the monitoring and logging, you also need to set those up. You can integrate with CloudWatch, for things like authentication attempts. You can even use I think you could do policy evaluations in CloudWatch. That's a thing, right, Tristan?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then also CloudWatch, you can also specify the session duration. And then I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to go quick. But for logging, you can set that up just using CloudTrail. Set a trail for AVA API activity. You can have different configurations to alert or alarm, like using Security Hub or whatever. You can use, well, you should use log retention policies, preferably, with an actual lifecycle policy as well. And then you can integrate directly with a SIEM or SIM, or however you pronounce your logging repository tool and alerting tool. So yeah, that's kind of what you want to focus on when you're integrating all of these new things. There is one last thing. There should definitely be some sort of communication plan for your users, just because they might, start seeing something weird, a new login or whatever like that. You want to ensure that they know ahead of time that this is happening, giving them user guides or like facts, frequently asked questions, support channels, office hours, whatever it might be, to ensure that your users know that a new authentication is coming. That way they don't think that they maybe been rerouted to a malicious source or whatever it might be.
Yeah. And I think that's part of it, right? At what we're trying to achieve is, how do we get to a point where the user is safe from their perspective and understand where they go and has a seamless experience, while on the other side have the correct policies, procedures, and posturing available, right? And then in between is the sweet spot. So what we're trying to get to is having that defense in depth approach and figuring out, taking that step back, how do we get to a point that we have the knowledge to go through, understand, and kind of figure out, hey, this is what's working for my organization. This is what I can do to help me overall build some aura, but also get to a point where, hey, I know a couple of the steps to do this, right? And a good place to start with this is usually the documentation. So what we will go to is exactly that. So AWS Verified Access documentation. There's the benefits, the location, and this is how you start off your L100 journey. To, if we were going through the apprentice gatekeeper as our methodology right here, this is how you start off and start to get to, hey, what is AVA? How does it work? How do I get access to it? Things of that nature. What is a trust provider? All these things can go into in depth. And we also want to say that same thing can be said, what Victor is saying, multiple points of impact. And there's also, hey, CPU utilization. How do I do this? Multi-tenant. All these items you can figure out and go through during your level 100 journey. But eventually you want to get to a part where, hey, I'm 200 now. I'm an access defender. How do you do that? Well, you start off with security. And this is the piece that you never want to kind of stay away from, because it's top priority. Because once you understand level 200, you get to be a zero trust architect, especially with AVA. And there's a bunch of documentation. And one I would lead you with is, hey, how do I integrate with another provider that's not AWS? Through this, you can learn a bunch of different items of how to protect, how to figure out the different stages within your environment, because you're the architect. I think it's a good tagline. But in order to do that, Russ, what do we have to do really quick?
Create an incident response plan.
Yeah. And that sounds like a good place to stop for today. So thank you, as always. And join us next week as we continue to deep dive into security, into fun, and building up those experience points. So until next time, have a good day. Take care.
Have a good one.